when I was in school, we learned about it. Apparently, that curriculum is missing because a lot of you don't know much about the Constitution. Here to help you out on our 250th birthday with the Constitution of 1789, a new intro, is the author and law professor, Ilan Wurman. Good morning, Ilan. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Very excited to talk with you and your guests.
I'm very excited for you to be here, too, because why don't Americans know what the Constitution says? Because they think they have the right to do whatever they want, but they don't understand that with rights comes great responsibility.
Well, as George Washington and John Adams said, a constitutional republic depends on a moral or religious, these go together, but often, but they don't necessarily have to, but at least a moral people. And what is the foundation of a moral people? Well, part of it is education, part of it is culture, part of it is upbringing in families, Republican families, small R Republican families, right? And so the Constitution is one thing, but the Constitution is really downstream of culture, family, politics, and we've sort of lost sight as, constitutional conservatives as well. It's not just about the document itself. It's about a lot of things that are upstream upon which the Constitution itself sort of depends. And as you say, it really starts with education, too, and we lack a lot of it. Part of the reason I wrote this book, an introduction to the Constitution, as you just said.
Yeah, and I'm glad you did, because a lot of people want to argue about this, but they say, cite your facts. I'm like, the Constitution. So they get really
right.
mad
I can
at
read
you.
it.
Yeah, I read it. You should go give it a shout. But the ICE raids and the things that are going on, people are protesting like crazy. It's absolutely constitutional for us to remove people who are here illegally.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at Minnesota. So this.
Oh, God bless you.
Yeah, it's pretty close to home.
I'm from North Dakota, so I know the kind of hell you're going through, and all my friends live in Minneapolis, so I got you.
Oh, you totally get it. And, in my view, the state and local authorities actually have it kind of backwards. When you go back to the founding era, to the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, if you wanted to keep federal officers at bay, the way the Anti-Federalists, the people who distrusted central government power, the way they wanted to do it was they wanted state officers to assist the federal government in enforcing federal law. Why would they want that? Well, because if state officers enforced federal law, if there were state tax collectors rather than federal tax collectors, then you wouldn't need a swarm of federal officers to come in and potentially oppress the people. So what's my point here? Is that these sanctuary cities get it exactly backward. If you refuse to help the federal government, then you're inviting federal interference, right? You're inviting the federal government to send what the Anti-Federalists called a swarm of harpies or swarm of federal officers. So it seems to me that these policies have them exactly backward. If you want to interpose between the federal government and the people, then at least assist in handing over the worst of the worst in your jail cells, for example. But they refuse to do even that. So it's a very delicate balance, federal and state power. But it seems to me that the folks in Minnesota really got it backward if what they wanted was to keep the federal government at bay. So I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, them and Illinois are just back-asswards. We have freedom of speech in this country, and we all know we have freedom of speech, but you do not have freedom of threatening to kill people. You do not have freedom of just saying whatever you want without repercussion. People have that so backwards as well.
Yeah, there's a freedom of assembly, but freedom of assembly does not mean freedom of interference with law enforcement operations, right? And, of course, none of this justifies necessarily like excessive police violence or anything like that, but that's a separate issue, right?
Yeah, when you start hitting them, it does.
No, that's right. You also create a risk of interference, a risk of conflagration, right? A risk of these encounters if you are where you are not sort of supposed to be. And so it's true, like as you said when we started off this show, with liberty and freedom comes responsibility. And so they didn't believe in just this libertinism. They believed in ordered liberty. They believed that a free people required responsibility, as you suggested. And so, when you have people who exercise their rights in a very improper way, that puts the whole project at the whole project at risk because people aren't going to want those rights going forward. But the truth is, those rights just have to be responsibly exercised. Yes, you had to have the freedom of speech. It doesn't mean you have the freedom to protest and block people's access to campuses, for example, college campuses. It doesn't mean you get to advocate for the extermination of the Jewish people on college campuses and things like that. With rights come responsibilities, as you said at the very beginning.
You really also don't have the right to walk down Jewish neighborhoods dressed in your Intifada and Caliphate clothing and your war signs saying death to the Jews through their neighborhoods, threatening them and expecting them to just, hide in their homes because they're scared of you. That's called terrorism, and that's not freedom of speech.
Yeah, there used to be a thing called incitement, which apparently only applies to the President of the United States, in 2021, but it doesn't apply to the actual, chanting of we want to exterminate Jews and so on.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing, in a constitutional republic, it can't be, certain rights for me but not for thee, right? You have to try to apply these things as neutrally as possible. It's what I try to tell my constitutional law students about the federal and state role, right, which you could apply to the Minnesota example. If the shoe is on the other foot, I mean, it sounds like something out of the Old South,
It does.
The way they said there was a federal occupation, right? And so you always have to think, if the shoe's on the other foot, what would the constitutional principle in question be, sort of behind this veil of ignorance? And unfortunately, our rights, the Constitution, the law generally, is used too instrumentally on both sides, but I think especially on the left these days, it's
they're
more
fully
about power
wearing
than
those
principle.
veils. Yeah, the judges who are on the left are wearing that veil you talked about, like they are nuns in a Catholic church. I mean, they are sitting there going against what the Constitution says because of feelings and that they don't like what's going on because of their political thoughts and processes, and that's not why they should be on the bench. They shouldn't even be on the bench if that's what they're going to do.
Now, of course, most of these judges are just deciding a lot of these cases that they don't even have power to decide.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I don't even know if President Trump has the authority to demolish the East Wing or not. But, what I do know is that somebody who occasionally, walks her dog in front of the White House, that doesn't mean you get to bring a federal lawsuit over something, right? Judicial power requires a real private injury, a real case or controversy. And too often you have these judges who just think their job is to police the lawfulness of government action generally. And the answer is no. You need a private injury to invoke the judicial power, to invoke the judicial role. Take the National Guard cases. What gave Gavin Newsom in California or the governor of Oregon, what gave them standing, so to speak? What gave them a cause of action to sue over the National Guard deployment? Historically, 200 years ago, when the militia was called during the War of 1812, literally the way this got to the courts was some guy was called up, to the militia by James Madison. He thought it was an unconstitutional calling forth of the militia, so he didn't show up. He was court-martialed in absentia. He was fined, and he didn't pay the fine, so the local sheriff came and seized his horse. And then the guy who didn't show up sued the sheriff, for trespass and conversion of property.
God.
That is a judicial lawsuit, right? That is a judicial power. And we don't do that anymore. Now judges just think that their job is to be this roving council of revision that just decides on the lawfulness of whatever the executive does. But the problem is there are 660 individual district judges throughout the country, and it just can't be that a single judge in Oregon or Massachusetts gets to decide executive policy for everybody, in all of these
and
cases.
What? The East Wing was starting to crumble. It was in kind of poor repair. It needed to either be rebuilt or removed, and those were the options, and he thought, I'll build a ballroom. I mean, it really wasn't used for much anymore, and nobody cried when Obama put in tennis courts and bowling alleys. Nobody cared when JFK put in a swimming pool. So presidents have been altering the White House to their tastes. Michelle Obama's quite horribly. But you've got to look at the fact that all of the presidents or the first ladies have done something to change the White House. Everyone's like, it was historic. I'm like, it was so historic, it was starting to fall apart. So I'm kind of glad it was gone.
Yeah. Yeah, and look, everybody understands that it is needed. Even the Democrats know that it's needed, but because Trump is doing it, they're not going to admit that,
Exactly.
right? But I'm just, if you really, the number one thing we could do sort of to restore respect for the Constitution is, this is like pie in the sky, perhaps, but Congress needs to restore itself in some way to like its original constitutional role and its original constitutional function. It needs to do more legislating. It needs to pass more bills. It needs to stop delegating so much authority to the executive. You know, when you look at that statute, like, yeah, maybe you could demolish the East Wing based on the statute, but like historically, Congress, after the War of 1812, you know, the British burned down the White House. Congress said, you know what, let's rebuild the White House. Congress really stepped up throughout history. And not just, you know, for its own purposes, but Congress has the power in the Constitution to help carry into execution the powers of the other branches of government. Congress gets to establish lower federal courts. Congress establishes the Supreme Court. Congress gets to establish departments in the executive branch and appropriate for the White House and so on. And Congress used to take that role very seriously, but now it's all partisan politics. If it weren't partisan politics, Lon, they would have they would have passed a law authorizing the ballroom a long time ago, right? If it wasn't about partisan politics, they would have expanded the lower courts because they're overworked and we need more judges. And actually, the Congress, on the eve of just as the Biden administration was leaving, okay, at the end of 24, almost unanimously enacted a law that would expand the lower courts over a 10-year period. But then Trump won, and so Biden vetoed it because he didn't want Trump to be the first mover, you know, have the first opportunity to fill these lower courts, these new lower courts with new judges. And so it's all about partisan politics today, which is really sad because Congress used to have such an important role in our constitutional system, and we should try as much as we can to recover that.
Well, good luck. They can't agree on anything. Even Chuck Schumer disagrees
I said
with
pie
this.
in the sky.
I know. Schumer doesn't even agree with himself from 10 years ago, so he's arguing in the mirror. But I have 1.5 minutes left. Maduro had to go. He was not the elected leader of Venezuela. We've got some idiotic Americans saying that Trump is trying to assassinate world leaders, including in Iran and Afghanistan, or not Afghanistan, but Venezuela and other places. These are not elected leaders. They are terrorists who have taken over countries, and him plucking them out it's absolutely within his power, and the people who he is doing it for are pretty stinking happy about it.
So I have a whole chapter in my book on the original distribution of the war powers between Congress and the president. I'll do it in 30 seconds.
Okay.
But the thing is, even today, if we tend to ignore kind of the original distribution, the modern framework was sort of established by the Obama administration, by the Office of Legal Counsel, when they bombed Libya. They bombed Libya without congressional authorization, leading directly to the death of Muammar Gaddafi. Okay? And if that is constitutional without Congress, a bombing campaign that leads to the death of the Libyan leader, then surely capturing the Venezuelan dictator Maduro in a very precise operation also doesn't require congressional auzation. Now, maybe you think the Obama thing was wrong, and it maybe was wrong under the original meaning, but you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, again, you know, which is a point we sort of come back to many times.
Yeah, everybody thought he was the bravest guy in the world when he did that. Trump does it. Oh, my God! All right. Ilan Wurman, he's a law professor, but he's also the author of the Constitution of 1789. A new introduction for those of you who've not read the actual Constitution, so make sure you check it out. Where is your book available, sir?
It is coming out this week. You can get it in any bookstore. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at Cambridge University Press's website. If you go to Cambridge and you use the code Wurman26, just my last name, Wurman 26, for the year, I think you'll still get a 20% discount.
Yeah, get it for the liberal in your life for Christmas. Enjoy. Ilan, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.